Hey everyone, welcome. This is Dr. Vic, and you're listening to the Wellness Path podcast. I'm excited to have you here. If you have listened to a previous episodes of ours, it was called Little Light Chiropractic. We actually changed our business name back to our original, which is the Wellness Path, and we decided to change our podcast also, so that it all syncs. So I'm excited to have you here and dive deep into the elements of what we'll be talking about here. This podcast, again, is going to be very about a variety of things when it comes to health. That's going to help you elevate from a physical, chemical, psychological, and energetic states. And it's going to allow you to really empower yourself. So we're going to talk about a broad base of topics. We will get into a lot of pediatric stuff, and then we're going to go off into very different things. And we'll always try to keep it to help with adult and also ped related, so that we can really share how to help elevate yourself, your family, and so much more. So I'm excited that you're here. As always, due diligence for housekeeping in a podcast. Make sure you like, subscribe, and follow. We are also all over social media. You can find us at The Wellness Path. And we have it on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We do have a TikTok. We're not there just yet. But we also have a YouTube channel. So you can find all the links in the show notes and so much more. So today's episode and the next few to come, so just know that this is what we'll be talking about, is brain development in kids. And the critical part of what is really missed when we look at children's health, it's what got me into pediatrics back in 2016. Had a very thriving practice, and I was unfulfilled too in many ways, but what happened was I looked at, I heard a stat that came through, and it was talking about 53% of kids have chronic illnesses. And I was just like, that's alarming. In my background in understanding neuroscience, subconscious mind, how the brain's developed, the things that I knew already, I was like, what is that doing to our future generations? And emotionally, mentally, neurologically, how are we adapting? And I made a decision. I talked to my wife. She runs the office with me. And I said, you know what? I think I want to go into peds. At the beginning, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew something had to change. And as I went through the process, I realized peds is where I wanted to go. I've been out of practice for a couple of years. I got back in, and I've been hearing a stat again, talks about how kids are now, chronic illnesses will be up to 80% by 2026. Again, this is not saying that's where it's at. It's just where the data is. It's saying where we're going. The trend is leading to that. And so I'm like, okay, I think I'm back in the practice. I'm making a dent here. I'm going to do all that I can. And I'm only one person. I can't do everything. I know that already. Different Dr. Vic, as I like to say, than compared to like 10, 15 years ago. But one of the things is that I've learned and I have seen in my 7 years of serving peds and families and so much more, is that a lot of this has to do with brain development. And there's a lot of things that are missed. All right. There's a pyramid to how the brain develops. And so if you think of it as like 3 different stages, okay, there's the reptilian part of our brain. That's the oldest part of our brain. And that's known for our survival mechanisms. Okay, this is where it's instincts, it's reactions. It's what keeps you alive. All right. Very, very important. The middle part of our brain is that primate mammalian part of our brain, our memory, our language, our connection, so forth. That's where that part of our brain comes into. And then they have the higher level, which is the cortex, is the highest part. That's the highest level. That's our different types of critical thinking, future planning. There's all these different things that come into that element. There's more to this than just that. I'm trying to keep it simple. But that's where, these different layers of it. Now, the way the brain develops as a kid, when we first are born, our brain develops from the bottom up, from the back forward, right? Now, this is critical to know. I have a whole, if you're a parent and you want to really understand this concept really in depth, I have a 4-part video series that I'll put in the show notes for you that dives into this brain development, the certain neurological laws, and then what's the root cause of what we're seeing in kids' health, and what can we do to change that. In this podcast, I want to talk about one of the things that I do that really starts to look at this and is almost the premise of it all. It's not the beginning, and I'll get into what that is and why that is, but it's the premise, almost the premise to everything. And I saw this later in my career. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm going to be very transparent here. There was a point in my career where I was like, why are certain kiddos? And maybe this is OCD. I used to be an ADHD kid, so this may be where it comes from. But I was like, man, I want to, I was seeing some kiddos that I use this specialized space certified technology that will look at the kid's nervous system and so forth. And I would get so frustrated that some of them, just some, it was a very small percentage too. It wasn't like a lot. Maybe it was less than 10%. I couldn't get their nervous system to change. They would change. Well, let me take that back. It would change. It just wouldn't clear fully to where I'd be like, wow, we really got all through this. And it was so annoying. And it wasn't until a few years later where I started learning about these processes, and I'll get into what these are in a minute. And that opened up my door to start to realize, wow, there's more to this. And there's things that can set these children off and get them stuck. And I'll explain what stuck means and all that stuff. So when we started to, when I first look at everything, so I said it's not the premise, but it's close to it, because everything starts at the birth. Actually, now new science is showing it actually starts in the womb. These conditions, we call them imprints on the nervous system. So an imprint, just so you understand, is like a conditioning. It's a code. It's a download program to have them think life is in a certain way or run a program a certain way. So, it can be how mom's feeling. Maybe mom's nervous about having a kid. Maybe they got pregnant and they didn't want to have a kid right there and then. There's that energy. So there's that energy and emotional feelings. You got to remember, mom and baby are one. And so what goes on from the moment of conception? Now, how they figure this out, I do not know, guys. I don't. I've read the research. I'm being very transparent with this. It's really cool stuff. It intrigues me like crazy. How they figure these things out, very interesting. But I'll share an example, my own personal example. And there's many more than this, but I'll just share this one. When my wife was pregnant with our first, what she was doing was she would, last trimester, she just loved to bounce. It was calming. It was soothing for her. Very, very good to do. And so she would bounce on an exercise ball often. I mean, often. It was every night, at least a half hour minimum, right? Not continuously, but on and off. And here's the funny thing. You want to talk about programs and imprints and so forth. What do you think, still to this day, my daughter is 27 months as I'm recording this, when it's a lot less now, but it's still there. This is how powerful this is. What do you think is the one thing to calm her or when she needs to go to sleep? My daughter just doesn't go lay on a bed and sleep. The number one thing to put her to sleep, to have her take a nap if she needs it, if we can't just put her down, is bouncing. It was like that. The moment she was born, we could only bounce. We had to hold her and we had to bounce her. And then when she got to sleep, we have to stay in that position because she'd wake up, start a reflex, and especially later on when that went down. So it's funny because I looked at my wife. I said, "Okay, baby number two. When we get to that point in our life, no bouncing. There's no bouncing in the pregnancy." It's just funny because it's like, yeah, we condition that. Now, that's a simple little example. I hope you get it, that there's many different things. This is just a physical thing we did, but there's mental, emotional, chemical, all those things play a role, and it's conditioning baby because they're getting ready to come out. And, it's just like the immune system. Before they used to think, oh, no, the immune system doesn't develop after they got a developing immune system when they come out, and, it's not really there yet. That's all lies. We have the science to show that actually their immune system is in full development, and it goes rampantly on fire in the last 3 months before they come out. So anyway, I'm getting a little away from what I want to talk about today, but the birth process is the number one thing that causes it's the first of all. Okay. And you got to think about it. They're going through a very strenuous labor. There's so many different factors we can get into. It's all about where's mom, how's mom's pelvic and sacrum, how well is mom's mental emotional states, how does she have any, how does she handle stress when it comes to pain? Like there's so many variables there. Then there's baby, the positioning of the baby, the process of that. Those things come in, and then they have to go through the vaginal canal. If they do, some 33% of pregnancies come out C-section, so 31 to 33. So then there's that whole stressor, right? And there's all these different things. Were they induced? Were they not? Was it epidural? Was it not? I mean, there's variables to all this stuff. So And when it comes to that, though, that's stress on baby. It's definitely stress on the baby's neck. I mean, there's a medical doctor that just did an evaluation on babies' necks. He did 1,000 babies. He's a German doc. And he found that 80% of these babies had some sort of nerve thing going on that could affect their immune system and other functions. Chiropractors came around. We did the same thing. And we found out that there was a 95% of babies that were born had something what we call a subluxation, a miscommunication or interference in their nervous system. And so we know that that's where it all starts. That's the premise of where the beginning of it all happens. When I see patients, especially kiddos, no matter what age they are, as long as they're in the pediatric range, 0 to 17, I want to know the birth process. I almost want to do this with adults because it just gives me so much information to understand where they're at and what the things that they have going on and so forth. I mean, I could literally see a newborn a couple weeks out and I could tell you what head positioning, were they in position when they were being born, based on how the skull looks, how their eyes look. And I could just see that from that process. I could tell if there was a C-section or not. There's a lot of things that I can see just from visually looking at the baby. And I've gotten better with this, obviously, as time has gone on, and I've seen more and more and more. So it's one of those things where we can see all those things. And these are the beginning processes to all that, okay? Now, I wanted to share a little bit of that. Like I said, if you want to know more about this, check the link in my bio or in the show notes. I have a 4-part series workshop. There's no charge to this. You can just go ahead, you put your information in, and you'll get full access to it. It walks you through this whole process. It takes you through the 7 different stages. There's so much more in depth to this, and it's a very in-depth workshop. But I highly, highly recommend you checking it out. But long story short, in this one, I want to get into this next phase. This is where I'm setting you up for that. I want to get that, at least that background there, because now we can get into this phase. So there's something that babies have to have. Now, again, I'm going to talk about the 7 different layers as we go through these episodes here. I'm going to really break down brain development in kids, because I want you to understand, if you think of it like a pyramid, you have to fulfill the first one before you can go to the next one. So if this is taking care of the bottom, the first stage is done at 100%, then the next phase can be ahead and be focused. They'll have 100% focus to build that up fully. And then it'll be the next phase. And then that builds up fully. So they build upon each other. Okay. I really want you to see it from that perspective. The reason why I share that is because this is how brain development works. If something doesn't develop properly, it doesn't mean that that's the only area of the brain that doesn't develop properly. I want you to think of this like a tree growing. If a tree does not grow properly in the beginning, it's not going to all of a sudden, just because this first stage is not done well, we'll be able to fix that and the next stage is on. It doesn't work that way. It's whatever it is, that's what it is. It's like the sea of life on the ship. You're going in a certain direction. There's an optimal pace, a level path where you need to go. Once you deviate off course, we can only pull it back so far. And sometimes with kids, we have a certain amount of time. Research shows, it says up to about age 2, neurologically speaking, we can pull that back. So we got time with that. But this is where the first thing that's the most important is something called the primitive and postural reflexes. All right, this is huge, okay? So what are some primitive reflexes? It's the rooting reflex, right? These are survival mechanisms for the kiddo. This is why when a baby's first born, they pick up the scent of mom and they literally will crawl. Like they do the breast crawl. They'll get up there and they'll know they can't see that well, but they'll know to find the nipple through scent and touch. So once it hits the mouth here, they know to go to turn to that side. It's called the rooting reflex, okay? There's the palmar grasp reflex. All right. Then we have the spinal collant reflex, which is in the back. We have Babinski, which is on the feet. We have the plantar, which the toes do the same things, right? These are just some of the primitives. Now, there's different reflexes that turn on and turn off at different times based upon where they're developing from the brain side of things. There is also postural reflexes like an ATNR, an STNR, writing reflex. You get into TLR. These are different names for all this stuff. And I can give you the scientific names or the full name of it, but they'll be like, what the heck is he saying? So, but the long story short, those are important for developing also, for rolling over, for getting into crawling positions, from there to sitting to standing or crawling to standing. These are the developmental side that are critically important, okay? When these are done correctly, what I mean by correctly is they turn on and there's a certain time frame, like Rooting, Palmer, 6 months roughly, Gallant, Babinski, you're looking at about a year. And so when these turn on and off, right, because that's how these work, and then there's other ones that are going to turn on later and off, that tells me as a neurofocused pediatric chiropractor, how is the brain developing along the way? Right? Because there's different stages. Remember I said there's different stages that I'm monitoring. This is why chiropractic is not something that treats. It just doesn't. And if a chiropractor says, oh, I'm going to help you fix this, or I'm going to treat this, or I'm going to do this, that's not chiropractic. That's a medical approach to chiropractic. Chiropractic doesn't treat anything. Now you may be saying, hold on here, you're saying chiropractic helps, but then you're saying it doesn't treat anything. This doesn't make sense. Well, let me explain. Remember, I said in the beginning that chiropractic, when we look at something called subluxation, I'll get into that later, but what that means, but it's just an interference in that nervous system, communication back and forth. If you have an interference or miscommunication in a relationship, how well does that go? Right? Where's the mood? How's tension and stress? Are you calm or relaxed, or is there things going on? Right? This is the same concept here. And this is what happens to the body. So when there's a miscommunication going on, and it only happens when you have more stress than what the body can take on. Okay, remember that there's more stress than the body take on. That's why the first thing is a physical stressor that happens during birth. That's a lot, but the research is showing there's also chemical aspects that can play a role in the womb, and also mental, emotional, and even posture, right? The positioning of baby, how mom's positioning is, what imbalances are there going on. That's why it's so critical for mom to be, before baby's a thought, to get chiropractic care and be under chiropractic care for a while. And then even during pregnancy, absolutely necessary. I tell you, it's a game changer. And we'll have many podcast episodes on this. But that's just some of the things that we look at. So we have those things that are already going on. Then we have the physical stressor that comes in. And usually that's, again, multitudes of layers of stuff that's going on, right? And just to share, like, there was a study that was done that looked at umbilical cord blood, and they found there was a minimum of 92 toxins found in there already, and they're not even into the world yet. And so that's what I mean. There's a lot of stressors on these babies now than what there was before. And moms don't move. I mean, I remember I was talking to one time when my wife was pregnant, we were having a conversation, and we're talking about how women back in the 1900s, they moved totally different than they do now. And it made more sense to me as a chiropractor. So I'm like, it makes sense. They deep squatted more. They did this. They were moving around more. They're picking things up from the ground. They're bending down and squatting. I was like, they kept that mobility going. So it was more able to be more flexible and handling different things. We don't do that as much now, especially sitting in chairs and cars and driving and sitting. We changed the mechanics of our pelvic floor, pelvis itself, in different musculatures and so forth, which makes it harder for pregnancies in some way. So again, the focus on chiropractic. But getting back to the kiddos, though, we get to that point where these are certain reflexes that need to turn on and off. What happens is, and what we know, and I see this with kids a lot too, there's the moral reflex, which is that startle reflex. That's why a lot of people say swaddle your babies at night so they don't get woken up. We didn't do that with my daughter. I rather have my daughter have that full freedom of movement naturally. And yeah, there's a little more extra stress to that sometimes. It wasn't too bad, to be honest, and it worked out well. But one of the things is that this is why knowing the history, when I work with parents and kids, knowing the history gives me everything. Because if someone this is something I learned with my own daughter, if someone has a traumatic birth process, there's a really good chance the moral reflex will stay what we call retained. What that means is it doesn't turn off like it's supposed to. Now you have to understand, my daughter was under chiropractic care. Moment, she was adjusted within the first 30 minutes. I let her be with mom, and I wanted to have her mom moment. And then once it was time, I was like, let me have her. Let me do my adjustment. Check her first bone, atlas. I want to see how it's moving. Give her a nice little adjustment. Make sure it moves really well. And it was a very important moment for me. And that being said, so what I found out later was, though, and this is what I already knew posture reflexes, I already knew primitive reflexes, but I didn't know this one. Sometimes traumatic births will maintain the moral reflex, and it shows up later in a children's life, early on, infant's life, 4, 6, 8 months. Sleep disturbances can be one of the biggest things. They have nightmares, they can't sleep well, they get startled very easily, or they get bothered very easily in the middle of the night. And after about a few months in, I started looking at that and I go, hold on, there might be something here. She's getting adjusted. We're checking other things. She has no other reflexes are on. They're all where they needed to be. But that moral, I said, well, I can't really test it per se, but I can put her into some mechanisms that would help with turning it off. And I said, let's just see how she reacts. And she showed it in a very minimal way. And so I was like, wow, that's interesting. Now, why am I bringing that all up? Because what happens, again, looking at the long term, right? Kids, there's different stages to their growth. A lot of times people think from sitting, from rolling over to crawling to walking, and that's, those are the milestones. Well, no, there's developmental, there's speech, there's language, there's learning, there's social, there's different layers to this part. So getting into this, when you look at the posture and primitive reflexes, it's really critical to make sure that those are going at the stages that they need to. It guides me along the way. When they are not, we call them retained. So when I first see an infant, I'm looking to see if they're on. The ones that should be on should be on. If not, then we got to get those up and firing. Then there comes a point, though, if they don't need to be on, they're called retained, which means they're still firing. What that does is it disrupts the growth of the brain, the developing brain. And this disrupts a lot of things moving forward. And so there's something part in the nervous system called the vagus nerve, or the parasympathetic nervous system, which the vagus nerve makes up about 90% of it. This nerve, I call it the brake pedal. There's other chiros that do this too, but I learned it this way and I love it. It's the brake pedal part of the system. What does that mean for you as a parent? This is going to be, and you have this too, this is going to be that part of your nervous system that's for self-regulating, self-healing. Also, growth and development, rest and digest. Okay. So pay attention to those words, right? Self-healing, self-regulating. So that's very important, but also growth and development, right? That's why chiropractic is so powerful. That's what we work on. That's what we build up. We build up your brake pedal system. And I'll have a whole podcast on this stuff. But when we build that up, that's how we can help you be more adaptive to your life, which means we're going to help you become healthier. Chiropractic is in its own world. Nothing does what chiropractic does. And you can't force this stuff. You can't do something outside of it. Chiropractors are the only ones that can do this. And neuro-focused chiropractors, those who actually look at the nervous system to see how it's functioning and help improve the function of that through helping improve the communication, that's going to be the game changer. That's what makes a huge difference. Okay. That's why I tell people, if a chiropractor says I treat your low back pain, or I treat this, or I do that, that's a medical approach to chiropractic. That is not chiropractic. And I want to make that distinction very clear. When I was thinking about when we were redoing things for the podcast, we had a big gap in episodes. I really wanted to say, well, how do I want this podcast to be different? And I really want to establish that this is the difference of what, one of the things to understand is this is what chiropractic is. And so looking at then what does this all mean for you and your child developing wise, is if you don't have these things functioning right, these reflexes, maybe posture or primitive and some other things like that, that disrupts the rest of the growth going forward. Everything from that moment is all disrupted. So let me explain how it works, right? We said before, the brain develops from the bottom up, from the back forward, okay? If you first stage, only develop the brain, goes to a max at like 90%. Everything from that point on will only be 90%. That's the highest it can be. And I can tell you right now, based on my experiences, it will not be 90%. That's just my experiences, my practice, 6-7 years of focusing strictly on kids. So, but the thing I've realized is that because when you don't, it's like a tree that only gets 90% of nutrients, it can only get max at 90%. It's not going to be able to get more than that. And depending on the storms and the systems and the drought and that's going to stress it even more. Same thing with children. And that's what happens in these different layering effects. And we're going to get into all that in another episode. I'll start to connect the dots a little bit as we go further in. But this is a critical point because of these posture reflexes, and I see these in adults because I started testing adults with posture reflexes back in my practice because I started to see that I used to get frustrated. I'd be like, man, a lot of people I work with, their spine changes without me recommending exercises or nothing. It's just a neuro-focused approach and we're seeing the changes. But there were some that were stuck and I used to get annoyed by it. And of course, one of the guys who created the technique that I practice, I talked to him a couple times and he's like, we don't treat anything. So why are you even worried about that? I'm like, yeah, but he goes, there's a lot of things that could be showing up why that doesn't happen. And he goes, that's not your job. And I was like, man, I agree with him. I totally understand. But I'm just like perfectionist in a way. And I want to figure out, okay, well, what can I do? So I started researching more about posture reflexes. And I said, well, I do this in children. I'm looking at it there. I was like, can that disrupt an adult's posture and not let them correct? I found some answers. So I said, okay, let me look at some patients and see what's showing up. And so I looked at different what it was showing up in their spine I would think in my head, that must be a weak STNR, or they don't have TLR firing as well, or this person has a writing reflex issue. Their neck was turned a certain way. It was favoring a certain this aspect. I said, this is probably a missing. So I was just looking at things and saying what makes sense. Okay. And through the process, I found out that I had a little pattern developing. I wouldn't say it was strong enough to be like, oh yeah, this is what it was. But I just said, man, let me, I see some midline issues here. I see some stuff here. Let's go forth. And all of a sudden, I would see posture changes happen drastically for those who did the work in conjunction with the chiropractic. And the patient was like, man, I didn't realize how weak I was. I'm doing these little simple motions and I'm weak. I said, yeah, these are things that we need to work on. And it was fascinating because when we got it integrated, right? The reflex is integrated now, which means it's what it needs to be at that time. Then all of us, like, let's say if they can't do a certain reflex, not fully held, then we integrate it back and all of a sudden they'll have it. And all of a sudden it shifted and changed their posture beautifully. And I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Because what I learned within kids and also in adults, right? I see posture reflexes affecting adults and their posture, but I also see in kids, when you have these primitives not firing well or not turning off, the biggest thing that I noticed, and I noticed this late in my practice before we moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, was I started to see how, remember I said that kids that weren't regulating, they couldn't get to clear their nervous system properly. What I learned is that these reflexes just makes it harder for that vagus nerve to fire properly, especially like a Moro reflex that's still stuck, like it's not clearing out, it didn't turn off. That creates low vagal tone, which makes it a lot harder to stimulate the vagus nerve, which makes it harder for growth and development, which makes it harder for regulating and so forth. And this regulation is a lot of things, right? We're not just talking regulating the body, not just hormones, not just growth and development, the paces of where it should be, but also behaviors down the road and learning and speech and all that stuff. So this plays a whole role. And I started to see that. I'm going, wow, there's a lot here, and so this is why it's the premise for kids to be evaluated under a chiropractor, not to find what's wrong, because we don't look for that. We just look at what do we have to do to optimize. And we can help any kiddo at any level with that. Whether if they're severely on the autistic spectrum or just barely on the spectrum, or they have ADHD, or they have nothing at all going on, right? I love when a parent brings a child to me and they're like, I really don't have anything going on with my child. I just want to make sure they're overall well. I want to make sure they're functioning well. I'm like, man, this is great. Don't get that often, but I'm glad it's great. Because I'm working from an area that we're not so much as stuff. I still find things, right? I still find stuff that's happening from a primitive side or a postural or cranial or all the stuff that I do. But what's interesting though, is that we can move out of that faster. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I had to remember, this is why I don't put like my own projections on things, because I remember I had a family of 5 come to me. And one of the kiddos was highly functionally autistic. As I was talking to the mom, I said, most likely, based on what I'm seeing, just based on symptoms and history, he's going to be the one that's probably going to have the longest part of the care. And she's like, that totally makes sense. I get it. What if I told you he tied with one of the youngest ones? He was out of that phase of care within like 2 to 3 months. And the oldest was the one that had to go the longest, which she was shocked by because she had nothing going on. Neurologically, she did, but it just didn't show up with symptoms. And obviously she's older, so these patterns of imbalance, they can get more and more stronger. Like when I work with kiddos who are, let's say I'm working with a 10 or 12-year-old who has stuttering or has had ADHD for a while or had XYZ, it's going to be a little bit of a process. It's not going to just go away as quick. We're not going to get balance things out fast because there's been a longer time for that to cultivate. There's more imbalances that go on. It's a snowball effect, right? And so the momentum of that snowball going down the hill is to determine how can I stop that thing and turn it around. And so that's where these postural and primitive reflexes are so critical. And this is where chiropractic shines to help with that, to really, really dive deep into these things, because this is the game changer for these kiddos. Now, you can go, some people say, well, these are great. I'm just going to go to an OT and do this. It doesn't work that way. I could tell you right now, the experiences, and this is the thing, I've had these experiences because a lot of times moms are bringing their kids to me in my office where they've been to the OT and the PT and the speech and this. And I'm not saying those things will work. I love working with OTs because they then I'm like, great, I'll leave you to what you do with the postures and all that stuff. And I'll focus strictly on the chiro, the neuro, the cranial, and all the stuff I love to do. But it's one of the things where when I see it in conjunction with that, chiropractic with all that, it's a game changer. It maximizes. I have a kiddo who spoke only 50 words, 50 and 100 words, 6 months into a speech therapist, slowly, progressively getting there. and gets under chiropractic care. 4 months later, they're up to 500. Right? It just maximizes the experience, right? Again, remember, if you think about it from a self-regulating, self-healing, growth and development state, that's what we really focus on in that nervous system. Can we help with speech? Can we help with development? Can we help with XYZ? Of course we can, because we're going to help the body and the nervous system develop and get to that point of where it needs to be. And so that is the key element I wanted to share for this first episode. And we're going to talk about a few more. We're going to dive into this process a little deeper in the next episode. What's stage 2? What's affected there? If that doesn't happen, what's stage 3? So no, I didn't share a whole lot on that because we're going to have other episodes for that. We're going to dive into it. What does that mean? Show examples of it and so forth. The episodes might be a little shorter too, so we can get more snippets into this. But I wanted to give you the lay down the foundation of this and really look at first. Overall cap is that when first things happen, it's always going to be in the womb now from a chemical, mental, emotional component, even physical. And then once they come out, that physical process, so forth, is what's going to set the stage. And then we look at how are these reflexes turning on and off. There's different parts of those stages of life, but where they are, where some come back, some turn on, and some should be turning off. And we look at where they at, their age, and how that should be appropriately doing. When they don't, that's where it starts to disrupt brain development. And that's the big thing as a pediatric chiropractor. That's what I'm focused on the most because once their brain develops, there's not a lot we can change. We can still change a lot. Don't get me wrong, but in the first 3 years, a child's brain is 80% their adult life. In the first year, it doubles. There's just a lot going on. There's over, I think, what was it? There's 1.5 trillion connections, and in 1 year, it's like 15 trillion connections, synapses as they call them. That's tremendous brain growth. Okay, and so we want to make sure that these connections, these synapses, and so forth, are vibrant and supporting, not for survival mechanism. Well, there are some there too, but it's in a very growth and development state to make sure that child is growing and developing as the way they were naturally designed to be. And that's the key element of what we do. And that's the key element what I want to share and empower parents. If you have questions, check out in our show notes, or you can info at wellnesspathchiro.com. That is our website. You can reach out to us there. Any questions, topics you want us to discuss, check us out on Instagram and social media and so forth. Wellness Path Chiro. You can find us. All our handles are the same. We keep it simple. But appreciate you guys. Please share, like, and so forth. Check out the show notes for all the additional information, the 4-part video series and whatnot. And last but not least, thanks for tuning in. And I look forward to seeing you